Against intensity.
Open University.
One of the key parts of my strategy as Momus, as a songwriter, has been to be against intensity. And I'll explain what I mean by that. It's essentially an anti-romantic strategy. It comes probably a little bit from my personality, which is a quiet, introverted, and yet slightly puckish personality. I'm playful, and I like to be a little contrarian and controversial, but within the bounds of the accepted discourses of the day. So I don't think I'm, outlandish. But I do think that I had natural attractions to particular periods of literary history. When I was studying literature, and well, ever since, because I've been sort of very engaged with literature. So I was particularly drawn to, for instance, the playfulness of Apuleius or Lucian, or these sorts of, or Martial, these sorts of classical authors who just amuse you with amusing tales which are not full of bloodshed or earth-shattering emotion. And I'm drawn more to the 18th century than the 19th century. The 18th century is sort of elegant and aphoristic, in my mind anyway, and weirdly prefigures postmodernism in the sense that you have a lot of picaresque tales. Also the 17th century, the century before the 18th century, Cervantes and all that stuff. You have tales which are simply spinning out in often very amusingly playful ways, very minor pretexts, like Tristram Shandy, Lawrence Sterne, a huge influence on my writing, which makes mountains out of molehills, really, and never really gets to the stage of the author being born. There's so many diversions on the way. The diversions are the essence of that book. So the 19th century, which and this is the reason that I'm sort of very much anti-rock, and I come from an anti-rock tradition within rock music, which is the so-called rockism movement of the early 80s, notably started by Simon Reynolds, as far as I'm aware. That rockism was seen as the next sin. That political correctness, identity politics basically was a machinery to create new sins in a kind of new Puritan movement, which was leftism meets punk ideals meets meets witch hunting, basically. And of course, John Ronson has written a book called So You've Been Publicly Shamed, which really is the culmination or the ideal observation of what that has turned into, with social media matching up to this kind of witch hunting mentality in which there are new sins. I think we can now say we've come to the end of that, because we have a president in America who's been elected who was apparently Teflon, apparently completely unable to be brought down by all the sins of sexism, racism, that could be thrown at him. So these are obviously not concerns for anybody except we tragic, trembling little indie kids in our bubbles, in our ghettos. But anyway, rockism was kind of half humorously proposed as a kind of new sin, and rockism consisted in being into the ideology of rock, which is essentially a romantic ideology from the 19th century, pushed into the 20th century. Sort of the ebbing ripples, perhaps, of Lord Byron coming into rock music. The idea of the value of a writer being all tied up with his emotional, passionate intensity, which can also be sexy. It's a sexy intensity. But it's if it's eros, it's also thanatos. There's a kind of... The ideology of living fast and dying young is a romantic ideology, of course, that the artist has seen too much, seen too clearly, he's doomed to die, you can't know all that and live. He knows too much, in a sense, or he's felt too much, the idea of an outpouring of emotion. And you get it into the 20th century in some poets like Rilke. This continues, sort of romantic view, but you also get a a backlash, and I go with the backlash, which is Brecht versus Rilke. I mean, I like Rilke as well, but Brecht, particularly in his volume, the poems for those who have recently arrived in the great cities, or something like that. It's not exactly that title, but it's when he first arrived in Berlin. He came from Augsburg and via Munich to Berlin, and the impact of Berlin's indifference, its urban indifference, was really strong on him. And he wrote this book about the great cities, and the poems essentially say, they talk in the voice of the city, and they say, we're indifferent to your particular struggles and concerns, and that's something you have to deal with, grow up. The world does not revolve around you. It's kind of a refutation of the special snowflake thing as well, because the special snowflake, the identity politics, which is all about a schismatic identification with ever tinier victim groups, needs to be told that as well in the voice of the city. Actually, it's not all about you. You have to fit yourself into what we do here in this city, and what we do is we enjoy ourselves mostly. I mean, this was the Weimar Republic that Brecht arrived into, and it was a highly political place, a highly unstable situation, but also a place of great hedonism, joy. The great city of mahogany is how Brecht kind of portrayed it a bit later on. And that's... it was called Neue Sachlichkeit at the time, the new objectivity, and it's the successor movement to Expressionism. So you have the early Expressionism of Die Brücke, especially the Berlin painters, Kirchner, and again I have a lot of respect for those people. I love Kirchner, the painters who influenced David Bowie so much, and David Bowie collected them, Haeckel, Schmidt-Rottluff, and all the rest of them. They were living basically a German version of the South Sea Island fantasy of Gauguin, that you can disappear off, to the other side of the world and live untrammeled by natural restriction, by civilized restrictions, in a state of nature, or a state of paradisal bliss. Really, have as much sex as you want with whoever you want, bathe naked in the lakes, and this they could do in the Berlin lakes. They went down to the lakes and bathed in summer anyway, naked, and lived a very bohemian life, which looked like a lot of fun, although it was interrupted constantly by these world wars, which were minor inconveniences, or major in the case of Kirchner, who depicted himself famously with his hand cut off, unable to paint because of traumas caused by the First War. And after the Second World War, he retreated to... just before the Second War, he retreated to Davos in Switzerland, and was sort of a basket case in a lot of ways. So intensity keeps breaking out, even if you try to avoid it, or the wrong kinds of intensity. I think we see a lot of art movements in the early 20th century, like Futurism, which are all about buying into intensity. Futurism is Romanticism plus mechanization, in a sense, because it's all about celebrating the new machines, the cars, the aircraft, and the military machinery. And in a sense, the pitilessness of the city, its indifference to individual suffering, or the romantic idea of the individual hero, is part of Futurism as well. So Brecht is, because Futurism is mostly a right-wing movement, but Brecht is a left-winger, but he's influenced by that essential attitude of de-individualization and de-romanticization. So anyway, by the time we get to because these movements are happening in the mainstream culture in the early 20th century, and then they happen again in rock music. So you get the Cabaret Voltaire, for instance. It becomes a band in the 80s, the 70s, but also the idea of the ideas that in the actual Cabaret Voltaire in Zurich were being explored in the 1920s, or the late teens even, start to pop up in ZTT label, for instance, which Paul Morley is kind of masterminding, and which releases the records of Frankie Goes to Hollywood, or the modernism, which you can hear in even Gary Newman and the Human League and people like that. These were the last ebbing waves, ripples of the modernism of many, many decades before. That modernism hitting the suburbs. People like Gary Newman, who, and obviously in 1920, Gary Newman's great-great-grandfather was not going to be aware of futurism. He wasn't reading Italian little magazines and, reading Marinetti's manifestos and things. But so it took a while for the idea of, wow, the shock of the new, to reach the suburbs, and the British suburbs especially. And so I remember, being there in the 70s, reading Malcolm Bradbury's big book about modernism, which is just called Modernism, with great excitement, and thinking that was terribly exciting. And the modern, or the modern, even with an E on the end, was actually what was animating things like the NME's graphic design, when you had a guy called Savage Pencil who would do these. The NME published in 1978 the NME Book of Modern Music, or Modern without any music, and it had all these illustrations and design by Savage Pencil. Or was it even Barney Bubbles? Barney Bubbles might have done it, actually. Savage Pencil, I think, did the cartoons, but maybe Barney Bubbles, who did the Stiff Records graphic design as well. And this was like a cartoon version of Victor Vasarely and Juan Miró and all these people from about 50 years before. So it's kind of amazing that there was a kind of early postmodern return to modernist ideals, but really just as they were fading out. And it's a kind of ironic second take. If you listen to the Human League, the modernism of the Human League is a kind of, say, tongue-in-cheek, glossy magazine article about modernism. It's not really modernism itself. It's a early postmodern take on modernism. So anyway, part of this same period was all about making a crime out of the romantic intensity of rock and rollers who lived fast and died young and wore black leather and chains and all the rest of it, who were essentially coming from the poète maudit tradition of Verlaine and Rimbaud. And so you had this weird spectacle of people doing a parody, rockers in black leather doing a parody of 19th century ideas, Gothic, obviously the origin of the Goths, who sort of became a movement in the early in 1984, from 1984 onwards. I mean, obviously it was starting a little bit before that. From 1984 there was this cave called the Bat Cave in London, which was really a home of Goths. But before that, people like the Birthday Party were obviously... Nick Cave was obviously a kind of proto-Goth. Susie and the Banshees were proto-Goths. There was a post-punk wing that sort of forked off into Gothic imagery. And wore black. The Cure, also proto-Goths. But also New Wave. So you had the spectacle of these Goths and rockers reviving 19th century ideas and having almost ideological battles at the same time with the people reviving modernist ideas, 20th century ideas. So that same battle was, in a slightly ironic, almost battle reenactment society fashion, was being played out between the 19th and early 20th century in the late 20th century. So my part in that is Hitler, my part in his downfall. My part in that particular battle is that I identified very much with quietness. And this was partly a practical necessity as well. Shyness and quietness, which tends to be expressed more in the works, in the pop records of women. So I was very influenced by Joni Mitchell at that time. And also of sort of gay men, very fragile gay men. So I was influenced by David Sylvian. The idea of a man who was too fragile to fuck, in the words of Paul Morley, who wore Clinique foundation and who came to Japan a lot and loved the very delicate and refined culture of Kyoto, for instance, and took Polaroids in an Andy Warhol limp-wristed way while at the rock gardens of Kyoto. So this all seemed very appealing to me because it also tied in with, it seemed to tie in with feminism, that we should, the new man should be somehow feminine and non-assertive, and somehow you could dismantle patriarchy. So you were anti-sexist as well as being anti-rockist. I guess it wasn't so much anti-racist because actually the next major pop music form that emerged in the 80s was rap music, and rap music was all about self-assertion, individualism, and being swaggering and noisy. And it wasn't such a surprise when Run DMC and Aerosmith kind of teamed up and made this record, Walk This Way, which was a rap track which suddenly segued into suddenly had these guitars, and that was also a joke about sampling, because wow, you could actually sample all these different types of music and you could splice genres, and that was all part of postmodernism too. But in terms of attitude, that was it wasn't an avenue we wanted to take. So I guess we were being anti-sexist and anti-rockist, but not necessarily anti-racist, because it was hard to find effeminate black music. I did actually sample and get influenced a lot by Sylvester, people like that, the disco artists of the 70s who were faggy, glammy disco. So You Make Me Feel Mighty Real was a very important record for me. And the turn I took from a sort of Joni Mitchell-ish sound on The Poisoned Boyfriend to a couple of albums later, Don't Stop the Night, was a turn towards campy disco music. I liked the dissolution and the implied decadence of disco music, the sort of sleaziness of it. I remember when I made this record, Lord of the Dance, Alan McGee misheard it as me singing Jesus Christ is a disco sleaze machine instead of Jesus Christ is a disco diva. And he liked the idea of Christ being a disco sleaze machine. Disco, in its new form of rave and house music and trance and all the rest of it, did become the next wave after that. I wasn't interested. I was left out very much of that acid house kind of revolution. Again, because I was too introverted. I liked the kind of PM Dawn, again, coming in the early 90s, a kind of weird turn towards spirituality. One of them, the fat guy out of PM Dawn, if I'm allowed to say that, just recently died, and that was very little remarked. One of the celebrity deaths that was much less remarked. Their first album I liked a lot, and again there was that kind of weird sampling take, because they had sampled Spandau Ballet on this weirdly spiritual, inward-looking and Christian. I mean, their first album was called something The Cross. Weirdly Christian stroke sexual melds that they were making. And I really bought into that, so you can hear that on Voyager, my early 90s records. I was accused of being like David Icke by the NME for my pains. But it was all part of essentially being an introvert, but also being interested in a contrarian, non-romantic identification. So my problem with intensity, it may be fear of life. There may be a certain fear of life built into it. I'm afraid of people who live too fast and die too young. I'm afraid of the very idea that you could take every single day and do something amazingly intense with it. I rather I prefer the idea of just kind of holding yourself back from life a little bit, preserving your innocence to some extent. I have a very mixed feeling about that. I do seek intensity sometimes, and I do risky and dangerous things sometimes, actually. But I also kind of want to have a long life, and so I've never done drugs, for instance. I've never sought out that form of intensity because it's too terrifying. The idea that you could simply turn the contrast and the color controls in your brain up to 11 is horrific, sort of horrific idea for me, because I tend to think that things are meaningful only within a very narrow atmospheric band, the atmospheric band around the Earth. I don't want to go into space. Space is just endless nothingness as far as I'm concerned, just like death is. That band of semiotic relevance is simply mostly for me, the urban experience of human cities on Earth, so I don't want to leave those. But I also, I want to stay in my safety net, within my safe area, safety zone. And artistically as well, I think there's a lot to be done within non-intensity, especially when you make it a positive strategy. I think I had this thing about easy power there's easy power in rock music, which is what I call full spectrum dominance. When you try to literally all the sound spectrum that human ears can hear has to be filled up all the time with something, so you have a very heavy bass sound at the bottom, you have very heavy hi-hats and sort of high frequency sound at the top, and everything in the middle as well. So it's a very thick sound, the sound of certain kind of rock records. I absolutely abhor that. I think there has to be, you have to use silence well, you have to use frailty and vulnerability in your music and space. But also the idea that there are formulae for easy power, which Hollywood movies which use ever more explosions and edits and all the rest of it. You can see, especially aggressive commercial culture, advertising has pushed in that direction. And of course, as an artist, you want to stay away from that direction. You can't beat those guys. You can't do more explosions and more edits and more sort of aerial GoPro jumping off cliff kind of shots than those guys already do. You don't have the resources mostly, but also it's a blind alley. How many edits physiologically can a human brain take before it just says, well, that's a flicker that I'm going to see as a constant. Certain flickers just become like a looking into a colored light. So I haven't followed that, and I've deliberately avoided any kind of formula which seemed, for instance, if you're writing a novel, hey, let's get the readers to invest a lot in this character and then kill the character. That to me is just pure emotional exploitation. I don't want to do that. Obviously, there's a power you can gain from that, but it's a spurious and indecent power. I would much rather go off and explore some strange little avenues and obsess over small details and make interesting incongruities, perplex people. Somebody actually left a comment under one of these videos saying, I feel like I've been in that Monty Python sketch, Perplex a Cat, or is it Confuse a Cat? It's a company that comes along in the van and confuses your cat for you. So perhaps that is a deliberate strategy, and it's more like the Oulipo, the Raymond Queneau approach, or the Perec approach, that you avoid the easy formulae by imposing your own ridiculous formulae, sort of arbitrary imposition of some formal restraint on your plot, rather than falling into however arbitrary and apparently stupid that is. It's like binding your wrists before you can write something. Nevertheless, it will stop you falling into, and this is why Eno and Bowie, when they were doing their more experimental records like Lodger, made the musicians not do anything just from their guts, this sort of feeling of playing from your tripes. They put up blackboards and said, okay, now they didn't allow people to know in advance what was going to be done. They just pointed to the next chord and said, play as if you're school kids, and it's the first time you picked up your instruments or exchange instruments. And, deliberately knacker your technical abilities. So that gets you away from the easy power of, hey, I know this great riff and it works every time. The thing that works every time is the thing you should discard. So easy power. And also you have to say that things which have already established their language of what's effective are things which are already dead. You have to you have to be constantly remaking the grammar of the medium that you're working in. And so that's what I've tried to do. Avoiding intensity is also a way of avoiding formula. You don't want to be formulaic. It's also being nerdy. I think you're allowed to be, it's a revenge of the nerds in a sense, because easy power is obviously best performed by powerful people, maybe even physically powerful people. So it may be that one day, this famous moment when you're on your deathbed, you look back at your life and you say, gosh, all I did really was I avoided temptation and sin and danger and intensity. And why did I do that? I could have had a much more interesting life. This notional endpoint which we all imagine from time to time, regretting not having done things. You don't regret the things you didn't do at that point. So it may be that at some point I will regret having abjured Abjuration is actually, since we talked about Roland Barthes the other day, abjuration is something he talks about. You must voluntarily abjure. And abjuration is also tied up with the idea of moving on, the idea of progress, the idea of constantly remaking your strategies and your approaches and your themes. So you have to abjure what was formerly. This is very difficult. It is very difficult. Habits, one of the only things you have as an artist are your habits. I have a tendency to do this rather than that. I have even avoiding intensity is a habit now for me. And sometimes there are moments when you just have to rip that up. This is why, again, came along with oblique strategies, which is a way to interrupt your habit patterns as a musician and to make you consider things from a slightly different point of view. Of course, when Eno uses those cards himself, he's basically not interrupting his habit, because the paradox is his habit is to interrupt his own habits, but also each of those cards was written by him or his friend Peter Schmidt, and therefore is something he has already thought he should do, or musicians in general should do. So it is a charged, paradoxical area. How do you get the habit of not having habits? But intensity also keeps changing its forms, and it's interesting musically how intensity is connoted now. I think I was just watching a live, David Bowie live version of Scary Monsters, which he did in the mid-90s when he was touring with Nine Inch Nails, and he has Reeves Gabrels playing this endless, obviously imitating Robert Fripp's solos, which were actually recorded, I think, without reference to the track itself, and were then sampled on tape, and then clipped out of context, cut and pasted basically by Bowie and Visconti into the track. So you get Reeves Gabrels trying to reproduce this randomly collaged guitar solo, but then just going way over the top and putting in too many notes, and there's essentially too much string bending, and it then becomes an inflationary spiral, a downward inflationary spiral, where the rhetoric goes out of connection with the emotional impact. So again, it's like this question of the edits getting so fast that they become a sort of constant flicker state, and then you just don't see it as events anymore, you see it as a constant. So the constant guitar solo becomes a chord, essentially. This is something Cage said when he heard Glenn Branca performing at a festival they were both at, and he had ironically, a very negative reaction, because generally his response to things was, there is no good and bad. Everything is fine. Everything is music. Everything is acceptable, equally acceptable. But of course, he didn't really feel that, especially when it came to music. And he did say that the one exception he had to that feeling was organized sound. That he liked any kind of disorganized sound, but once composers got their hands on something, they tended to ruin its organic qualities, which he liked so much, or its potentialities. So he hated Glenn Branca because he said it was a constantly sustained climax. It was very loud. It was a lot of guitars playing together. And for Cage, this was a return in a modern form to 19th century Romanticism, to the idea of the heroic symphonia with the composer's individual feelings writ large across the whole orchestra, and the idea of everything crescendoing towards some emotional climax of ultimate intensity, a sort of orgasmic thing. Another, maybe a final thought, is intensity and sex. That how could you be into sex, and the idea especially of a growing excitement which then culminates in orgasm, without being into intensity? And I suppose the answer to that is that you can actually, there's this sting idea of tantric sex, you can just indefinitely delay orgasm. You can actually regard orgasm as the enemy, because orgasm is, for man anyway, the culmination of a sexual process, of the excitement, of the ability to please the woman, because you tend to lose erection after the orgasm. So orgasm is something that one tries to stave off as long as possible if one wants to give pleasure, and also continue having low levels of pleasure. So I think it's okay. You can say that sex and lack of intensity are compatible after all, thank God, But obviously at some point there has to be climax. I mean, the whole process is, in a sense, conditional. The whole gathering excitement is conditional on the idea of a final discharge of excitement. And then you're thrown back into the black leather and chains and the whole 19th century syndrome.